Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining. And thank you for joining. Welcome to our webinar, Risk and Reward, which is about unpacking AI strategies. Some fail, many fail, we would say. Some succeed. And why is that? So my name is Arie van Berkel. I'm the Chief Product Officer here at Lux Research, and I'll be moderating today's session. Presenting today is my colleague, Anthony Schiavo. He's a Senior Director and Principal Analyst here at Lux Research. He's been discussing AI with many clients and also trying to help them get AI to work. So I'm really looking forward to what he has to say about this. Throughout this webinar, you can type any questions you have, and we do encourage you to type many questions in the questions box on your screen. On my screen, that's to the right. And time permitting, we will answer those questions. If we don't get around to all of your questions, and that's hopefully possible, it means you have many, we will make a selection, but we will always get back to your questions after the webinar. So we know we've seen your questions, we've seen what you typed, and we'll respond in email. If you have questions that you don't like to type in the question box, or you come up with questions afterwards, or maybe you talk about it with your colleagues on around the water cooler or something, and something comes up, you can always email us at questions@luxresearchinc.com. So that's questions@luxresearchinc.com, and you will see that email address if you fail to capture it, also on the last slide that we'll be sharing today. If you experience any difficulties, those are rare, but they do occur. Then what you do is you click the refresh button on your website, and 99 times out of 100, that will solve your connection issues. Now, before we start this webinar, just a quick word about Lux Research for those of you who are new to us. So we're an independent research and advisory firm, and we work with many of the world's leading companies to identify emerging opportunities. And those emerging opportunities can come from new technologies. It could be from new consumer trends. It could be from new market circumstances. And we look at all of those. And we help you make high impact decisions on innovation. We employ scientists, engineers, analysts, and industry experts. And we combine original research and methodologies with the practical decision frameworks rooted in innovation theory and, more importantly, even innovation practice to help organizations separate signal from noise and take those decisions. So we're looking at strategic foresight, we're looking at technology scouting, assessments, helping you accelerate also your developments. We're helping you find startups and discover and validate them. Having said all that, now you know us, and without further ado, let's look at the risks and the rewards of AI. So over to my esteemed colleague, Anthony. Please, the floor is yours, Anthony.
Thank you, Ari, and thanks everyone for joining us today. And today I want to talk about, AI, and we're really going to be focusing in on failure, right? Particularly the failure of many companies to implement AI successfully in different ways. We're going to start with a little bit of an introduction, talking about what the sort of long-term historical context of AI implementation really is, and why we need to get it right. Then we'll look at our 4 key reasons why AI deployments fail, and then back up a little bit, talk about the long-term rewards, but also some of the risks of AI implementation. So with that, let's get into the introduction. And I think it's no surprise to anyone, it should not come as any surprise to anyone, hopefully, that there are a lot of failed AI projects, right? The recent MIT State of AI Business in 2025 report found that despite this 30 billion to 40 billion investment into Gen AI, 95% of organizations are getting zero return, right? what's funny to me is that they say this is a surprising result. But to me, this is not a surprising result at all. And it's not because I'm necessarily an AI hater. In a lot of ways, I'm not. I've always maintained that technology works. But the reality of implementing large scale technological, software, or even business process transformation is one that, failure is very common, right? We saw this in the digital transformation era, almost a decade ago at this point, when digital transformation was sort of the new hotness. We had reporting from groups like McKinsey that only 16% of companies felt that their digital transformation efforts were actually improving performance, were actually enabling them to sustain changes in how they operate. And again, you can go even further back to the chaos report, which is one of the first reports on the implementation of software, right, of any kind in the business environment. And what the chaos report found was that the success rate for software projects was only about 16%. It was not much different than the digital transformation of the 2018s, the 2010s, and frankly speaking, not too different, I imagine, from the success rate that people are having with AI. I think probably today it's more like in that 15% range rather than the 5% MIT reported. So, this is just a failure-prone exercise, right? Corporations are just not good, particularly at implementing these types of technologies. And I think it's important to recognize that the reasons AI is failing don't necessarily have a lot to do with AI as a technology, right? It's not about picking the right model. It's not about generating the right prompts. It's not about anything to do with agents or even getting, really good AI experts into your organization. If you take away one thing from this presentation, I think it's this, right? That AI failures have a lot more to do with corporate implementation, with corporate structures and corporate processes that go into their implementation than they do with anything that's particularly AI specific. We'll talk about that in a lot of detail in the second section of this presentation. But just because 15% of projects are succeeding, 85% are failing, that doesn't mean that we're off the hook, right? That doesn't mean that we're off the hook to make this work. We know that our audience, that is to say, innovators and innovation leaders in the global community of corporations, are very much active with AI. From last year, last year's survey of innovators, we found that around 35% had already deployed their first AI applications in innovation, and another 25% to 20% were going to deploy within a year. And then, there's a certain percentage that's working on it, but doesn't necessarily have a concrete timeline. So, at this point, this is about a year ago, at this point, I'd expect a majority of my clients to be deploying AI into their innovation process, right? So you need to get this right because you're actively working on it. There's a real cost to failure, and there's some real upside to success. And, it's worth quantifying that corporations as a whole are spending a lot on AI. From the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, we see that corporations are spending $2,000 per employee, perhaps up to $280 billion on AI systems just in the US, right? So it's a lot of money that's being spent on AI. And, we're kind of in a bubble here. So if we want the economy to continue proceeding well, continue to chugging along and continue to grow, we need to make sure that this AI deployment is successful. I think we all have a big incentive to get this to work. So, with that in mind, let's talk about why these AI deployments fail. We've identified 4 factors that cause AI failure. And I want to talk a little bit about the sort of the process and the methodology here, because ultimately what we've been doing is interviews, right? We've conducted a number of specific interviews, that is to say, interviews just for the purpose of sitting down and talking about AI deployment with a wide range of companies across chemicals, CPG, food, industrial, our core corporations of interest, our technology areas of interest. And also, I am having a lot of conversations every day with my clients, right? They're coming to me and they're saying, hey, like, help us develop our AI strategy, help us develop our AI roadmap. This is where we're at with AI. So what I've done here is from those interviews, I've pulled quotes and I've synthesized these sort of four major issues that I see come up very consistently. And we'll talk about each one in turn. We'll give some specific examples. Names, have been sort of redacted. Some of the details have been changed around to protect the innocent. But these are all really based on our conversations with your peers, right? If you're one of the people listening to this webinar, this is really the peer group of companies that we're talking to here. So our four factors are governance, use case, data, and culture, right? And you can see these are not particularly AI specific, right? Data is maybe the closest, but ultimately these are really outside of, what LLM you use or the vendor or anything like that. So getting first into governance. Governance we define as the decision-making structure around AI. So, who approves the adoption of new AI tools and the development of new AI applications? Who actually does the development of those tools, right? And how is access to the AI controlled? And then if you have an idea in the corporate context, how do you propose that idea for development? So it's really about this decision-making framework, right? It's not really about cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is important. AI information management is important. And I'm sure that in most corporations, and hopefully in every corporation, the cybersecurity considerations are part of the governance decision-making process. But this is not about, cybersecurity in any particular sense. It's also not about data controls or data management, right? We'll touch a little bit on that to a certain degree in the data framework or the data component. But this is not about, we have Databricks or we're doing everything, through Oracle. This is not about that type of large-scale development. It's really about the corporate processes. And so governance failure, it often really looks like a breakdown between those who have the ideas and those who are in charge of implementing them. And we see this. There was an agrochemical business, primarily based out of the EU, but a global company. I had a chance to interview one of their digitalization leaders. And, basically he identified to me a failure case where there's a lot of interest in using weather data, which was already been pretty widely, deployed across various chemical agribusinesses. And the engineers and sort of the folks who are very close to the problems on the field and in the farms and had these ideas about how to actually implement this new AI project that they were doing. And so they developed a prototype at the sort of the field and the farm level. At the same time, there was a top-down sort of implementation. An external consultant was brought in. It was one of the major consultancy firms. They worked with leadership and they worked with the corporate groups to develop an AI strategy. And they actually interviewed and collected the idea from the engineers who were developing it at the sort of the ground level. And then basically told them, okay, stop working on this. We have this. We'll take this from here, right? And so the development then proceeded essentially in this top-down fashion. And ultimately, when the product was sort of redelivered back to the groups, it ultimately ended up not really aligning with the use cases and the needs of the farmers, right? Because those needs had evolved. There had been other projects and other products, other information capabilities sort of rolled out in the 6 months that it took. And it just wasn't as aligned with their real needs anymore, because that feedback loop around actually producing the AI had been cut. And this is a kind of a classic story that I've heard a lot of times across my conversations with clients, where different groups control the development and the rollout of AI, whether it's IT, and this limits the actual capability to roll out, um, or you have a lot of AI POCs and a lot of excitement, but no real way to turn them into successful projects because you don't have the right governance structure. That, I think, most importantly, includes the actual users in a kind of a structured way. The second type of failure we see is application selection and outcome management. At the most basic level, we're really talking about here what business processes are actually selected for AI deployment. And what is the application and the timing of that? What is the ROI potential measurement? What are the KPIs that are selected? What's the expectation of return? How long do you think this is going to take? And so this is really about within our existing business, what are those business processes? And what it's not vendor selection, it's not model selection, it's not anything technical related to AI. Use case failure, it often looks like misalignment between different groups, but I think it's distinct from governance failure in a couple ways. So I talked to this industrial company. They developed this sort of AI analytics capability. Essentially, they were embedding sensors onto one of their core products. And the idea was, okay, this sensor can detect when this piece of equipment is going to fail ahead of time, but also this provides a new data flow for us. We can take the data and we can then sell it back to our customers potentially. And this was developed by the R&D group. They were very excited about this. And they brought this to the business unit that was in charge of selling this component. This is a large company. They have a big central R&D. They have a lot of diversified business units. And relatively sort of narrow business stakeholders, if you will. And this idea was essentially rejected by the business unit. And the business unit did not see this as part of the core business, right? And it's funny because when I talked to, I interviewed the R&D person who developed this technology, right? I did not interview the head of the business unit. And when I talked to this individual, they said, they just couldn't see beyond their day-to-day business unit. And I actually, frankly speaking, am not sure that I agree. There was no sense that the procurement benefit was really that substantial of a benefit. It didn't seem like the R&D team had done a lot of work or had gotten, a business spec from the business unit before developing this application, right? Before selecting this use case. It wasn't really clear to me that there was an actual business need there that was being met. And, the business unit does have a responsibility to meet its targets. They can't spend a lot of time, or foot unnecessary costs if they're not going to clearly solve a challenge they're having, right? So I don't think it was really unnecessary or unreasonable, I should say, for the business unit leader to reject this, this R&D person's idea, even though I think they were a little frustrated by it. And so that failure to really identify, hey, we have a key business problem, we're going to solve it with AI. If you say, hey, we have this new AI capability, let's take it to the business unit. It's like you're going to end up failing a lot of the time. And I do think the flip of that often happens as well, where, I talked to this, there's this quote here on the side. I talked to this Latin American CPG company, and, the guy said, look, we get a lot of unnecessary and unrealistic requests. And I'm lucky because I have a great CIO, a great CTO. They can basically say no to everyone for me. But if I didn't have that, it would be very challenging. So this can definitely go both ways. But I think if you don't have that core business case underlying the application, you're always going to set yourself up for failure. Third, we have data, right? And data, I'm really focused on data generation, not necessarily storage infrastructure or the amount of data you have. Now, obviously, there can be some data storage challenges, but I think the real key thing is, what is the availability of novel data? Is it coming from sensors? Is it coming from labs, R&D? Is it coming from market channels? Do you have a meaningful understanding of the data and some kind of real world outcome? Do you really understand what your data is telling you? And then can you source new data quickly and easily when necessary? So obviously, if all of your data is coming from 30-year-old equipment and it is being put onto machines that are still running on MS-DOS, that's obviously a problem. But I don't think you need a large-scale data infrastructure here. You don't need to be on Databricks to be successful with AI. You don't need a huge amount of GPUs. You don't need your own AI cluster. That's not really what this is about. It's really about the practical links between the real world and the data and your practical ability to generate new data. I think a good example of this would be this data failure. There's this US-based metals company, and they were working on developing a materials informatics capability. And they were doing pretty high-end metallurgy. I believe it was maybe even a powder metallurgy. And, they had this, essentially they were trying to develop, a model that would help them formulate these metal compounds, right? And the problem was doing the sample creation in the lab took, on average, maybe a couple days to a week. But then they didn't have the right testing capabilities in-house. So they would have to mail the samples to a third-party vendor, a third-party lab, who would then test them and then get back to them. And often this whole cycle took at least 3 weeks, if not a month. Then you add in, people go on vacation, people have other work to do, blah, 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 all these sort of, factors. This was no one's primary job. And all of a sudden, the cycle to actually iterate this model began to look really, really slow. And 6 months went by without a huge amount of improvement in the quality of the model because you need 10, 12, 15, 20 iterations in some cases to really drive a model that's going to be very accurate, depending on what your problem is, right? And if you were able to do the testing, make sample creation in a day, get data back the next day, you could iterate, in 2 months that many times. But, through no real fault of the AI software or the AI approach, the data velocity here was too slow to really solve the problem they want to solve. And ultimately, the project sort of fizzled out. And you can see sometimes it's not just about data velocity, it's also about data specificity. I talked to this data analyst at an international CPG company, and they told me they had built this really comprehensive and very, very analytically intensive system for forecasting sales, and it just didn't work. And what they realized ultimately is that local holidays and local store level promotions were actually totally critical to understanding the sales of these snack and soft drink products that they were selling. And so you can have all the macroeconomic data that you want, but unless you have the data that really actually drives, in this case, the consumer behavior, it doesn't matter. And lastly, culture, right? Culture is about trust between employees and top management. It's about their fears of replacement with AI. And it's also about how employees advance in their careers, right? It's not AI skill use or AI skill level, right? It's really about how much are employees willing to try new things and experiment. And you can see this can be a big challenge, right? There was a US-based chemical company. They had an AI tool kind of for search, materials informatics related search, with the goal of sort of identifying, hey, where are the good materials within our company to solve client problems. This is sort of a diversified and more specialty company, not really a commodity company. And this ultimately ran afoul of sort of a cultural failure, right? Employee rejection. Some employees didn't think that the system was accurately capturing their work, right? Accurately capturing their materials. And they were worried that it was going to deprioritize them in terms of sales. Some just didn't trust computers at all, right? They didn't trust the system. And then, there was also a sort of a negative environment. There had been an attempted rollout of the electronic lab notebooks that had been a real disaster. So people were deeply suspicious and skeptical of these type of data tools. And ultimately, no one wanted to adopt this technology, even though it worked. The creators felt that it worked very well. And there was a real problem. This was a consistent source of lost sales when they weren't able to identify the right material for the customer. It it ultimately didn't succeed, right? And I hear this from other companies. There can be a lot of friction when you have data analysts coming and talking to people in R&D or innovation who have been doing their jobs for 30 years, right? These data analysts don't always have the EQ to necessarily handle that tricky conversation. And I think it's important to recognize that the junior people, who are often the ones who are most inclined to want to use AI, look up to senior scientists. They look up to senior employees because they want to follow their career path. And so if the senior employees are saying, hey, I don't like AI, the junior employees are going to be turned off of it as well. So what does good actually look like in our view? Well, I think it starts with an AI council. You need to have some top-level body that's responsible for setting AI goals and objectives, approving use cases, approving pilots, and also identifying unacceptable risks. Then you need to have an AI sandbox team, right? And this is both an infrastructure as well as a team who can support that, who's working on proactively identifying AI capabilities, bringing them in-house, and also the ones who are fielding the requests. And this needs to be a little bit distinct from IT because IT's function is really risk management. If you just give this to IT, I think they'll constrain it a little too tightly. You need to include IT, but also create a separate function whose goal is much more towards enablement. And then lastly, you need AI champions. And these are people within the business who have been given time and resources and goals to achieve with AI, right? And they're the ones who are best positioned to sort of identify the use cases for AI. But it's very important, you've got to give these people time. If you just add this on top of their day job, they're not going to be able to do it. And so in a good system, you have these champions proposing up use cases to the sandbox, who's highlighting the risks and costs to the council, who's approving and funding this. And all of this should be done in a kind of a structured and consistent way. A lot of the companies I talked to who were confident in their AI said, yeah, we have a very constructed intake form when people propose new use cases. There's a business case identification. There's an explanation of the potential ROI. There's an explanation of the potential need. When we evaluate these things, we have a very consistent way of evaluating and ranking what we're looking for. So this type of consistent framework is really necessary to be successful. So I want to leave you with a few final thoughts in terms of the long-term risks. And I think what's important to recognize is that AI, it enables a lot of high-effort tasks that were just previously sort of not feasible. You couldn't really hire 500 people to read every single patent. Just not possible, right? And it's still not possible. But with AI, we can approximate something like that. But I think the most important thing to recognize about the reward is that there's often this focus on core business transformation, or top-down transformation. And I think this typically misses the mark. You're probably pretty good at your core business. And if you're not, well, I don't know if AI can help you, frankly speaking. But there's a lot of low to medium sort of reward tasks that end up in this kind of perpetual nice to have, but never need to have category. And I'm sure you can think of these. It'd be nice to have some kind of automated checking of startups, or it'd be nice to have, there's newsletters I never get to read. And I know I should really keep up with the technical work in my field more. That would help me. There'd be some value to me in doing that, but I just don't have the time, right? And what AI does is I think it moves the needle on all these things, right? There's all of these categories where before the effort was too high for the reward. And AI doesn't change the reward, but it dramatically lowers the effort in many cases needed to actually accomplish a lot of these things, whether it's analyzing large amounts of data, whether it's developing a structured report around something, or whether it's pulling more information into your innovation function. There's lots of small changes that are now possible with AI just because we sort of pushed that threshold of effort out further. And transformation, in my view, it's a result of all these accumulating little benefits, right? Not some big top-down effort. So the goal should really be to think about what's the simplest and the easiest thing I can do with AI. But It's also important to recognize there's a real risk of skill loss. And I think that's because corporations are creatures of techne. Techne is sort of the ancient Greek philosophical term for knowledge, but it's a specific type of knowledge. It's rational, systematic knowledge that comes to us from universal principles, right? And corporations are very good with this type of techne. They're creatures of rational, systemic knowledge, from the science itself to the organization of the company. But there are other types of knowledge, and the Greeks recognized this one called metis, which is practical, specific, and local knowledge. It's knowledge that comes from practice and knowledge that comes from experience. A fisherman knows exactly where the fish are going to be in his little neck of the Greek islands because he's been fishing there for 50 years, right? And if you took him to another part of the world, he would probably not be very helpful to you. But he has this incredible local knowledge. And I think corporations are really institutions of techne. They've always struggled to manage metis. And we know this. We have, there's a thing called a work to rule strike, where the workers work exactly as the codified, rational, systematic rules the techne instructs them to. And when they do this, everything falls apart because there is a lot of practical knowledge that's necessary to actually run the operations and the day-to-day work of a corporation, right? And what's very interesting about AI is that in a lot of ways, it is a tool that can capture metis. It's a technology of seeing. It allows knowledge to be visible by sort of simplifying it, discarding it, scaling it. AI is very unique in this way because unlike a spreadsheet or a memo, it is multimodal. It's non-standardized. It can manage all this different information. It doesn't have to be put in the form of a spreadsheet. It's quite flexible in this way, and it allows us to capture new types of information and potentially systematize it, and then ultimately automate by acting across that knowledge. But when we, as a society, develop these new technologies of seeing, they have often these hard to predict effects, right? In the 1765, we had new bookkeeping methods and new methods of surveying forests. And this solved a major production issue in Prussia, which is that they didn't know where the productive forests were. They were able to find them, they were able to cut them down. There's this big boom in timber output. It's great. And then they had these spreadsheets. They said, hey, we know we need exactly, we have so many hectares of forest. We need exactly this many tons of wood. We will plant in clean, structured rows exactly enough trees to meet our long-term production forecasts. And they transformed the forest into this, structured object that kind of matched the bookkeeping tables and became very easy for them to survey. But then in about 100 years, these forests ultimately ended up collapsing and dying because there was a huge amount of other ecological diversity that was lost. And that ended up being necessary to sustain the life of the forest, right? And I think about the corporation like this forest. When we use AI to systematize, automate potentially things that hadn't been automatable before, we are, I think, losing that metis, that practical knowledge that the individuals who used to do those tasks had. Perhaps it can be recovered in the AI, but I think almost certainly we're going to lose a lot of that. And I think these consequences, the risks from doing that, are really difficult to predict, and they can be quite long-term and quite slow to surface. So before you automate a task, think about what is the local knowledge, what is the metis that we are replacing, and do we really understand how valuable it is? So with that, I want to leave you with a few key takeaways. First, as I said, AI failure, it's not a function of AI-specific factors, right? Companies have been struggling to implement technology, information technology, for 50 years. This is not likely to change. I don't think there's anything structurally different about the implementation of AI compared to these other business systems. And, it can fail for cultural, use case, data, or governance reasons. And before you succeed, before you successfully deploy AI, think about what you're going to lose, this metis, right? This practical knowledge that lives within your organization. And so, Ari, I just want to say one final word. If you're curious about your performance of your team in terms of implementing AI or succeeding at your goals, any of these other things, I encourage you to check out our survey. We have an innovation survey. We did this last year. We're doing it again this year. This year, we're really focused on benchmarking performance. It is anonymous. You can check it out anonymously. I encourage everyone to take a few minutes. It only takes maybe 5 minutes to fill this out. It really helped me out personally. So if you enjoyed this webinar, please check out the survey, and you can get the results as an output of doing that. Thank you. And Ari, I think we can open it up for questions.
All right. So thank you, Anthony. I've been watching the question box. There's been quite some questions dropping in, and don't be discouraged. You can still add more questions to it. I'll be picking a few of them out of the collection, and don't forget, we'll try and we'll answer all of your questions, even if we don't get to it in this webinar. And you can submit more questions at questions@luxresearchinc.com. But meanwhile, 16% failure of IT projects historically, right? The historical record is quite damning. And so one of the people asking questions was reminded by that of all of the systems that have been put in place to deal with that. So we owe a lot of our project management systems, for example, things like Prince or the IPMA system of project management, to those IT failures.
Yep.
So are we simply not using those project management skills and systems that have been developed in response to it? Or is there something really different that those project management sets now are kind of failing again or need to be amended, or what's going on there?
I think it's a necessary output of the sort of the cutting edge nature of this, right? Like, what I mean by that is we are probably now much more successful at implementing software, right? If you say, I want to purchase a new piece of software for my corporation, right? That has become standardized to the point that I don't think we have a 16% failure rate, right? I don't think 16% of people are succeeding when they want Word or, SaaS, the Salesforce, right? I think it's probably like 95% of people are succeeding. But with AI, we don't have that level of expertise, right, within the organization. We don't have the history of successes and failures, right? And so when people were first migrating to these SaaS cloud platforms, I'm sure the failure rates were much higher. It's really a necessary part of the adoption curve of any new technology. And I think the reality is, as much as you can say, oh, well, these all end up failing for the same reasons, that doesn't mean that there's a sort of a generalizable way to succeed at them from first principles, right? Just because we know that corporations fail in pretty consistent ways across time, that doesn't mean it's avoidable. People still lack experience in doing new things. That's just the reality of that. And they are going to make the same mistakes that you can classify from the outside as being the same mistakes as in the past. Don't look like those mistakes, when you're internal, right? If it was that easy to solve, I think we wouldn't be doing this webinar. So just because we can recognize the patterns historically doesn't mean that when you're inside the institution trying to accomplish these things and do something new for the first time, that it fits into these obvious patterns from that viewpoint. And that's kind of why I think it's important to have someone, outside the organization do these interviews and think about this from an outside perspective.
Right. So there's another question that kind of is related to this, I think, in a certain way. And I see some people who are really thinking about the process you showed with the AI Council, the sandbox, and then going from ideas to the sandbox, again to the AI Council. who should be on that council? Because you also mentioned use cases, selection of use cases, and the right people being involved. But then that sounds like it's creating sort of a circular reasoning, because you need the right people on the council that are involved with the use cases, but you don't know upfront when you establish the council what the use cases are going to be. So how do you bootstrap that system?
I don't think you need the council to be very big. And I don't think you necessarily need it to have representation, for example, from every business unit, right? That's one of the things I often see is like these things you can kind of, if you end up, any group over 5 people, I think can't effectively make a decision. Maybe that's just years of working at Lux Research speaking.
I'd say that
But
aligns with my attempts to try and find a restaurant to eat at with a group of friends, roughly.
yeah,
So yeah,
you've experienced this, right? So you need to have it should be corporate people, right? It should be folks like the CTO, CIO, right? Um, an innovation lead, these types of individuals. But I think it's very critical that you are sourcing ideas up from the business units, right? And that you have people who do understand on some level, or you have the right forms, and the right structures to articulate the needs from the business units. I don't think you need to get every head of every business unit involved in this. And I think the risk is generally making this group too large as opposed to making it too small. But if you have systemic, if you have a good system for explaining the use case and the business case, and you have a good IT team who can understand how much it's going to cost and the timeline for actually doing it, I think that decision-making group can be pretty small and pretty high level. And that's how I would choose to structure it.
right. Okay, good. I think there's one, maybe two more questions that I have time to put in front of you. So let me be careful by selecting the right one. And there's one about data.
Okay.
So you talked about data readiness, and I think there's some concern here among the people who are asking us questions about, I don't know if I want to call it analysis paralysis, but I think it's its cousin, kind of data collection paralysis. So you could get stuck in just securing enough data, only to find out that based on the data you have, there's still more data to get, and maybe that other data is also good to have, and let's have some more data. And so you get stuck in a securing the data cycle without ever getting around to implementing anything.
Yeah.
How do you defend against that?
I think you have to have specific goals. And I think you also have to kind of be willing to throw away a lot of data, right? Um, one of the things I hear consistently is that historical data is often not that valuable, right? And you really need to say, okay, here's the problem. Let's design a data set that contains the information within it that can solve that problem, and then let's go out and collect that data. So I think starting from a problem, especially in like in an industrial or a materials or a context, right, where there's a specific technical problem to be addressed, it makes much more sense to figure out the experiment. It's kind of like an experimental design 2.0, right? I mean, this is not necessarily a new concept, right? You need to figure out, hey, what's the right data that's going to allow us to answer this question, and then go out and get it. Model building is not really that different from experimental design in that way. And there are a lot of established standards for experimental design.
Right. So then, final question, maybe a little bit more philosophical, perhaps. So you mentioned Techne and Mattis. You also mentioned culture, and so Mattis has a lot to do with culture. So if you're establishing a system that kind of contradicts the Mattis, and I've just personal anecdote, I've been there designing model predictive control in certain process units, and then you switch it on, and the day after, the operator switches it off because it takes decisions that they would never take.
Yeah.
In hindsight, those were still correct decisions, but it's just something, it's venturing into territory that the operators had never experienced. So what is a good way? AI seems like it's possible to capture metis in AI. What is a good way, or have you seen someone doing that successfully?
I don't believe AI can capture metis. I believe AI has a certain capacity to transmute metis into techne, that is to say, to systematize knowledge. But metis is always the output of experience, and it's always the output of, practice, right? It cannot be captured by nature, right? Like, and this is both, I think, a practical point as well as a philosophical point. Now, you can render it unnecessary. There's a great, interesting. I'm reading "Seeing Like a State." I'm finally finishing it. There's a great anecdote there about the fact that navigation by tides and by the position of the sun is no longer really needed because maps and charts and compasses have just become so ubiquitously available that that skill is now lost among fishermen in Southeast Asia, right? But they don't really need it, right? It's not lost because and navigation outcomes have gotten worse. It's just okay. We have this better system now. So sometimes we lose metis, and it's fine. I don't. Not many people know how to darn their socks. I do, but pretty poorly. But that's more because I take a special hobby interest in my socks. This is not a skill that has been, the loss of this skill has not necessarily been led to colder feet, right? We just have people replace their socks, right? So I think the idea of a system that can capture metis is sort of not really possible. I think AI is interesting. I think AI might be closer than anything else. I think in some ways AI can systematize metis into techne more powerfully than any other technology ever. But I'm not sure it actually captures metis as such.
Well, at least I learned, and I didn't know that you have a sock-related hobby. I don't. So
I like big, thick winter socks, and I like, they need a certain amount of repair and upkeep unless you want to throw them out every year, Ari.
Right. Good.
I live in Boston.
Anyway,
it's quite cold.
Sometimes it can also be warm. I experienced it.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. Before Anthony, I digress completely. Thank you for attending our webinar. I'm sure many of you have by now taken the opportunity to scan the QR code here. If you haven't, please visit our survey. You can see our email here, questions@luxresearchinc.com. So don't hesitate and send us any questions you have afterwards. For now, thanks for attending. After this webinar, we will be sending you a quick survey, which is not the same as our innovation survey that we just showed you, but a quick survey about this webinar. We're curious to see how you experienced it, if you found it useful, and if you found anything that you could implement in practice. Please take about 5 to 10 minutes to complete that. It really helps us to improve our future webinars as well. For now, thank you for joining. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you in our next webinar, hopefully.
Thank you.